When the lights dimmed and the cameras started rolling, no one could have predicted that a film meant to tell a story of heartbreak and healing would become the center of a real-life storm that shook Hollywood to its core. Whispers turned into headlines as Blake Lively. The dazzling star, once known for her effortless charm, found herself tangled in a web of lawsuits, secrecy, and silence. Justin Baldoni, the director and co-star, stood at the heart of the same tempest. The tension between them, visible to everyone but never spoken aloud. When they appeared at the premiere together, the world noticed something was off. He refused to stand beside her for photos, his distant smile hiding questions that everyone wanted answered, and behind the scenes something far darker was unfolding. A mysterious company named Vanzan, a lawsuit that seemed to exist only on paper, and a trail of digital evidence that led straight into the hands of lawyers, reporters, and fans who could sense that something wasn't right. Every document, every filing, every whispered name in a courtroom corridor added another piece to a puzzle that threatened to expose more than anyone ever expected. And tonight, that story begins with one question: what really happened? Behind the closed doors of Hollywood's most guarded feud, the story begins long before the cameras captured their uneasy smiles at the premiere, long before the headlines screamed about lawsuits and subpoenas, long before the whispers about betrayal and secrecy took over the internet. It begins with a film, a love story that was supposed to change everything. Blake Lively was cast as the lead. Her star power was undeniable, her charm irresistible, her reputation almost flawless. Justin Baldoni took the role of both director and co-star, a man known for his quiet strength, his emotional honesty, and his vision for stories that matter. But somewhere along the way, that vision fractured, and what was meant to be a simple production became a battlefield of control, power, and mistrust. When the trailer dropped, the world expected another heart-wrenching romance, but those who were close to the project whispered that what happened off-screen was far more complicated. Sources claimed that by the time filming wrapped, tensions had reached a point of no return. The director had grown distant. The actress was frustrated. The production crew caught in the crossfire between two forces, trying to shape a story that neither of them fully trusted. When the premiere finally arrived, the silence between them spoke louder than any red carpet interview. Justin Baldoni refused to take a group photo with Blake Lively, and that single decision sent shockwaves through Hollywood. Insiders wondered why others pretended not to notice, but every camera, every journalist, and every fan could feel that something deeper was hidden behind that refusal. And then came the lawsuit. A name appeared in the court documents that few had ever heard before. Vanzan. It was described as a company, but when reporters began to dig deeper, they found nothing. No social media presence, no visible operations, no employees, just paperwork filed under a corporate shell, and a connection that led back to Blake Lively herself. What was Vanzan, and why was it suddenly at the center of a legal battle involving Wayfair and Justin Baldoni? It started when Vanzan filed a lawsuit in New York State court against unknown defendants, known only as Doe. Defendants? No names. No real people, just a list of accusations that seemed vague and almost intentionally unclear. But only days after that filing, Vanzan sent a subpoena to Jones Works, a public relations firm with ties to Stephanie Jones and the production of the film It Ends With Us. That subpoena demanded communications documents and materials that included private information about the movie, about its stars, and about claims of harassment and retaliation that had never been mentioned in the lawsuit itself. It was as if the company had used the lawsuit as a key to open a locked door, a legal loophole that allowed access to data that would otherwise be untouchable. When lawyers representing Wayfair and Justin Baldoni discovered what had happened, they began asking questions. Who authorized this subpoena? Who was really behind Vanzan? And what did Blake Lively know? The answers were not coming easily, because each step toward the truth seemed to reveal another layer of confusion and contradiction. According to court documents, Wayfair's attorney Kevin Fritz argued that the subpoena had been used improperly, that it was never meant to collect evidence related to the claims in the Vanzan lawsuit, but instead was designed to gather personal communications from Stephanie Jones and others connected to the production. He claimed that this was part of a deliberate attempt to legitimize the use of data that had already been taken from another person's phone, allegedly belonging to Jen Abel, an assistant who had previously worked with Jones Works, according to her own filings. Jen Abel claimed that her phone had been seized, her data downloaded, and her private messages shared without consent. She alleged that some of those messages eventually ended up in the hands of Blake Lively, Reynolds, and their publicist Leslie Sloan. If those claims were true, then the subpoena from Vanzan could have been a way to make that data appear lawfully obtained, turning something private into something usable in court, if proven. This would mean that the lawsuit wasn't about justice, it was about justification. A calculated move to cover tracks and strengthen a larger case against Wayfair in Hollywood. Whispers began spreading that Vanzan was nothing more than a shell, a mask used to shield Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds from scrutiny. While their legal team maneuvered in the background, the court filings revealed a tug-of-war between Kevin Fritz and the lawyers representing Vanzan. Fritz wanted to compel testimony. He wanted answers about who was making decisions, who was involved in the subpoena, and how far back their communications with Stephanie Jones went. But Vanzan's team pushed back, arguing about technicalities. About dates, about what could or could not be asked. They objected to questions reaching back before September 27, 2024, the day the lawsuit was filed. But Fritz insisted that the relationship between Vanzan and Jones started earlier, that this was no coincidence, and that evidence from before that date could expose the truth. The judge eventually denied Fritz's motion, but not because of the merits of the case. Instead, it was denied on a procedural technicality. The parties had not properly met and conferred before filing, which meant the motion was rejected for not following the formal process. But that denial didn't mean Vanzan had won it, only delayed the inevitable, because in the process of responding, Vanzan had confirmed something important. They would allow questions about communications and relationships that occurred before the official filing date. That small concession gave Wayfair and Baldoni exactly what they wanted: a chance to explore the real connections that might prove that the lawsuit had been used as a tool rather than a legitimate legal claim. Still, questions lingered: who would actually testify for Vanzan? None of the listed representatives seemed to be business executives or company staff. Instead, they were attorneys, leading many to suspect that Vanzan wasn't really an independent entity at all. If it truly belonged to Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds, then their refusal to personally appear for testimony would become yet another layer of secrecy. And the timing only fueled suspicion. While the deposition date approached, Blake Lively was spotted at Disney World and Ryan Reynolds attended a public event. Neither seemed concerned about the legal storm forming around them, yet the filing suggested otherwise. Fritz claimed that communications from Vanzan's lawyers showed constant deflection, delays, and vague promises. Each message another piece of what he called strategic gaslighting. And while all of this played out behind courtroom doors, the story began to leak into the public sphere. Online commentators noticed that whenever attention turned toward Vanzan, new distractions appeared in the press. Stories that painted Baldoni as overzealous or desperate began appearing just as the legal filings about Vanzan gained traction. One report even claimed that someone posing as a process server had been arrested near Taylor Swift's home, sparking rumors that it was tied to the same legal dispute, though local officials never confirmed any connection. The timing was uncanny, and the tabloids feasted on it, framing Baldoni and his allies as reckless, while quietly ignoring the unanswered questions about Vanzan. Every headline, every online debate seemed to push the narrative further, away from the real issue. What was this mysterious company? Why had it filed a case against no one? And why did its actions mirror the private disputes surrounding Blake Lively's ongoing case with Wayfair? The more people looked, the stranger it became. The silence surrounding Vanzan became deafening because every time someone tried to dig deeper, they hit another wall. The court filings grew thicker with redactions. The lawyers kept repeating the same phrases, and yet between those lines, the truth started to breathe a little louder. People close to the situation began whispering that the company was never meant to exist in any real capacity, that it was simply a name, a mask, a paper creation used when things behind the scenes became too risky. For open exposure, the name itself felt like a code, like something chosen carefully to sound legitimate, but vague enough to hide behind. And when investigators searched for corporate registration records, they found almost nothing. A few filings. In New York, a handful of generic business details, and a registered agent who seemed to represent dozens of other shell corporations in the same building. This wasn't the profile of a fully operating company. This was something else. And what made it more suspicious was how the Vanzan case had been constructed. It was filed in a court where the defendants were unknown, meaning no one had to be formally served, and therefore no one could object to the subpoena that followed. It was a perfect legal maneuver to obtain private data under the pretense of discovery. But when Kevin Fritz and his team for Wayfair began connecting the dots, they noticed that the subpoena requested documents that had absolutely nothing to do with the case itself. The lawsuit made no mention of the movie, It ends with us of sexual harassment claims or of retaliation. Yet the subpoena sought documents that directly referenced all of those topics, as if the purpose of the lawsuit had been twisted into something else entirely. What could have driven someone as experienced and image-conscious as Blake Lively to take such a route? Some say fear, others whisper revenge, but many believe it was about control, about reclaiming a narrative that had begun slipping away in the chaos of rumor and accusation, because by that time the internet had already begun dissecting every possible tension between Blake and Justin, from the way they interacted on press tours to their refusal to share a red carpet photo. The speculation had grown wild, and the storylines more sensational. Some said Justin felt betrayed after seeing the final cut of the film, saying it wasn't the version he thought he was directing. Others suggested that Blake had exerted too much creative control, and that their friendship fractured under the pressure. And yet, amid all the speculation, the truth about the lawsuit threatened to overshadow everything else in the filings. Fritz outlined a timeline that felt almost surgical in precision. He suggested that the Vanzan lawsuit was filed immediately after certain communications had already been obtained, that the data from Jen Abel's phone had been accessed by Jones Works and somehow transmitted to Blake Lively, Ryan Reynolds, and their publicist before Vanzan even existed on paper. If that was true, then the lawsuit's sole purpose was to create legal cover for material already in their possession, a move that could later be used to claim that the information had been gathered through formal process rather than through unauthorized access. Fritz wanted the court to force Vanzan to produce a representative, someone who could explain exactly what happened and how this chain of custody was maintained. But Vanzan resisted at every step, offering statements full of technical jargon about dates, procedures, and relevance. Their lawyers insisted they had done nothing wrong, that they were simply complying with standard discovery. Yet when pressed on why their lawsuit included no reference to the topics they were requesting documents about, the responses became murky. Vanzan's lawyers accused Wayfair and Baldoni's team of manufacturing drama for the media, of trying to use the docket to create headlines and sway public perception. But inside the filings themselves, there were contradictions. They said they had no issue testifying. Then in another paragraph, they objected to the timeline. They said they would send a representative, but refused to say who that representative was. They insisted that everything would be clarified. Yet days went by with no confirmations and no transparency. It began to feel like a waiting game, one designed to exhaust the other side and confuse anyone following the case. And while this legal chess match played out, the entertainment world started to fracture into two camps. Those who believed Blake Lively was being unfairly targeted, and those who believed she had gone too far in protecting her own reputation. Friends who had once worked together stopped speaking. Publicists began withdrawing statements, and everyone seemed to be watching the same courtroom updates with growing unease, because if the allegations about Vanzan were true, it meant that one of Hollywood's most admired couples had engaged in tactics that crossed ethical lines. And if they weren't true, then the fact that they had allowed the confusion to continue suggested a deliberate strategy of silence either way. The damage was spreading, and it wasn't just reputational. It was legal. Wayfair's lawyers hinted that if they could prove that the subpoena had been used to collect private data unlawfully, they could move to have all of Blake's evidence thrown out and act that would unravel much of her ongoing case and call into question every claim made against Justin Baldoni and his production company. It became clear that what started as a quiet disagreement between co-workers had grown into a full-blown power struggle that now included major corporations, celebrity attorneys, and potential perjury. The filings showed that Blake had been difficult to work with throughout the process, demanding access to private communications, insisting on documents that others said didn't even exist, and accusing investigative firms of being part of digital campaigns against her, all of which the judge reportedly dismissed as unfounded. One court response even mentioned that her motion to compel against a firm called Sourced Intelligence had been denied because she provided no evidence to support her claims. The judge reportedly told her that just because she believed something had happened did not make it true. This pattern began to mirror what was happening with Vanzan, where overreach and secrecy collided in a confusing swirl of procedural filings and emotional reactions. But behind every motion, every denial, and every objection was a bigger question. Why take such risks? Why file a lawsuit with no real defendants? Why subpoena data that was never mentioned in the complaint? And why continue to fight so aggressively to keep the identities of those involved hidden? Insiders believe it was because the information at stake could dismantle the entire case, that without it, Blake's narrative would lose its legal backbone, and that revealing the truth of how the information was obtained could expose a broader network of missteps and misjudgments. And as the court drama escalated, so did the online one. Influencers, commentators, and legal experts started piecing together the filings in real-time, streaming breakdowns on social media and analyzing every document that appeared on the docket. Some sided with Blake, calling her actions a misunderstood attempt at protection. Others sided with Baldoni and Wayfair, pointing out the inconsistencies and the shifting timelines. But the one thing everyone agreed on was that this was no ordinary celebrity dispute. This was something far more intricate and much more dangerous. It was about control of information, about image manipulation, and about what happens when Hollywood's carefully crafted stories start to crumble under the weight of legal scrutiny. And in that uncertainty, Blake's silence began to speak louder than her words. Her lawyers kept filing, her team kept denying, and yet no one could explain the strange coincidence that every time the Vanzan issue resurfaced, a new story appeared somewhere else, pulling attention away as if orchestrated to redirect the narrative. It was a pattern too consistent to ignore, and it made the next court date one of the most anticipated moments in recent Hollywood memory. The next hearing drew more attention than anyone expected, because by then the case had become more than a legal dispute. It was a spectacle, a slow-motion unraveling of the image that had once defined Hollywood perfection. The courtroom was filled to capacity, reporters sitting shoulder to shoulder, analysts scribbling notes as if every word could ignite a headline. Outside, cameras flashed constantly, while online hashtags related to the case trended across platforms. Some sympathetic, some skeptical, but all captivated. The judge entered with the same calm expression seen in earlier sessions, but this time there was a tone of finality, as though even the court had grown weary of the endless procedural games. As the arguments began, Blake's team insisted again that the Vanzan subpoena was legitimate, that the purpose of the filing had been misunderstood, that they were simply seeking accountability for an online smear campaign. But when the judge asked them to identify who Vanzan actually was, the room fell silent. Their lawyer spoke vaguely about corporate structures, privacy protections, and ongoing investigations, yet none of it answered the simple question of identity. The judge leaned forward, repeating the question, and still there was hesitation. That moment became symbolic. It represented not just the case, but the atmosphere surrounding it, an elaborate narrative built on hesitation, implication, and avoidance, and the press seized on it immediately. Headlines the next morning captured the tension. One paper wrote, "The moment Blake's team couldn't answer." Another called it the silence that changed everything. And as these stories spread, so did speculation that something far deeper was being concealed. Soon after that, hearing, a series of emails surfaced, showing discussions about timing and strategy between lawyers, publicists, and digital firms allegedly involved in narrative management. Though no one confirmed their authenticity, they added fuel to the fire. It became impossible to separate what was real from what was orchestrated, and the online debate only grew louder. One side painted Blake as a victim of systemic online targeting, arguing that she had every right to defend herself with whatever tools were available. The other side argued that she had crossed into dangerous territory, abusing legal mechanisms to dig into people's private communications. And when public opinion split, the entertainment industry began quietly choosing sides. Actors unfollowed each other, producers declined to comment, studios distanced themselves from controversy, and suddenly the same Hollywood community that once celebrated her red carpet appearances was now whispering her name in the context of damage control. Even her closest supporters reportedly advised her to settle the matter quietly, but by then it was too late. The filings were public, the witnesses were being called, and the narrative had taken a life of its own inside the court. Baldoni's lawyers pressed forward with a meticulous presentation showing inconsistencies in dates, metadata patterns of access logs, and email headers that suggested files had been retrieved before official subpoenas were issued. It was a technical argument, but one that carried enormous implications, because if true, it could mean that private communications between creative partners had been obtained outside the boundaries of legal discovery. The judge listened carefully, asking questions that suggested a growing skepticism toward the Vanzan justification. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, the media frenzy reached fever pitch. Influencers live-streamed reactions, commentators dissected legal motions line by line, and the story became a cultural conversation, About power, privilege, and accountability, fans who once idolized Blake found themselves conflicted, unable to reconcile the persona of the charming actress with the increasingly complex image emerging from court documents. Yet there were still those who defended her passionately, insisting that the scrutiny was rooted in sexism, that Hollywood always turned harsher on women than men, and that the same behavior from male stars often went unchecked. This argument dominated talk shows and podcasts, for weeks turning the case into a mirror, reflecting Hollywood's double standards. But even within that debate, certain details kept resurfacing. Details that were difficult to explain away, like the timing of specific data transfers, or the strange overlap between her legal team and her public relations consultants. And when a legal analyst on national television read excerpts from Wayfair's filings live on air, the reaction was instant. The clip went viral, millions watched as the analyst highlighted phrases like material obtained prior to filing and intent to conceal procedural irregularities. Suddenly, what had seemed like speculation had become tangible evidence discussed in mainstream media, and Blake's team scrambled to respond, issuing statements about misinformation and privacy. Yet their refusals to address direct questions only intensified the perception of secrecy. Every move became a story. Every silence became an interpretation. And within Hollywood, the whispers became louder. Some executives allegedly began to worry that the controversy might affect future projects, not just for Blake, but for anyone associated with her production company. The ripple effect was real, as one producer put it. No one wants to be subpoenaed. Just for being in the same room, that line became a meme. A cynical reflection of how paranoia had now entered the creative process. Even Justin Baldoni, who had stayed mostly silent, began to appear more composed in public. His calmness contrasted sharply with the increasingly defensive posture of the other side, and commentators noticed this shift, saying that he was letting the facts speak for him rather than emotion. And as this perception grew, so did sympathy. The public started re-examining his earlier interviews, noticing the restraint in his tone, the way he avoided blame, the quiet sadness in his voice when asked about the project, and this created a subtle but powerful shift. Suddenly, the narrative was no longer about conflict, but about endurance, about how someone could remain composed while surrounded by chaos. The judge, meanwhile, ordered further clarification on Vanzan, demanding that a representative appear in court to testify about its structure and purpose. This order sent shockwaves through Hollywood, because if enforced, it could mean that the people behind the corporate name would finally have to step forward and speak under oath about what really happened, and whether this entity was used as a front to gather digital evidence improperly. The date for that testimony was set, and anticipation built like the premiere of a blockbuster outside the courthouse. Reporters prepared as if covering an award show. The irony was impossible to ignore. The same lights that once celebrated her career now illuminated her controversy, and everyone waited for that moment when truth would finally intersect with accountability. But as the date approached, something unexpected happened. Motions were filed to delay the testimony, citing scheduling conflicts and procedural concerns, and with each delay came another round of speculation. Some believed the postponement was strategic, meant to buy time to negotiate a quiet resolution. Others thought it was a sign that more damaging revelations were coming either way. The public had already made up its mind. For many, the delays only confirmed suspicion. Because in Hollywood, timing is everything, and avoidance rarely goes unnoticed. In the days that followed, media outlets began revisiting the origins of the case, tracing back how a single lawsuit that seemed obscure at first had grown into an industry-defining moment about transparency, ethics, and the misuse of power. Legal experts compared it to past scandals, noting how quickly public perception can change when legal tactics collide with celebrity culture. And as those discussions deepened, the emotional cost of the saga became evident, the human side beneath the legal jargon. The friendships broken, the trust eroded, the careers suddenly uncertain. This wasn't just about a lawsuit anymore. It was about reputation and legacy, and what remains when the spotlight fades and the filings are all that's left on record in the end. What began as a simple, creative disagreement became a mirror reflecting the fragility of power and the illusion of control. Hollywood had always thrived on image, on the careful choreography of what is seen and unseen. But this case shattered that rhythm, showing that even the most carefully constructed reputations could crack under the weight of truth. The court's final remarks were measured yet unmistakable. It was not about guilt or innocence. It was about transparency, about how far someone was willing to go to protect a narrative and at what cost. As the gavel struck, the silence that followed felt like an ending and a beginning. At once, outside cameras flashed once more, but the faces looked different this time, older, wiser, and haunted by what had unfolded. There were no victors, only survivors. The fans who once cheered now debated the meaning of loyalty. The studios that once rushed to sign names now hesitated, weighing risk against reputation, and through it all, the story of Vanzan lingered. Unresolved, a name that symbolized everything Hollywood tries to hide and everything it cannot escape. And as the city moved on to its next scandal, its next premiere, its next performance, those who watched closely understood that something fundamental had changed. The curtain had been pulled back, and behind it, the truth was neither glamorous nor cruel. It was simply real. And for those who lived through it, that was the hardest part to face.